Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Turbo 360's Guide to Freelancing. In this first installment, we're going to discuss the paths, the freelancing paths that one can take. There are different paths that really impact the way you find clients, the way you actually do your work, the types of projects you're going to do, and obviously pay and things like that. So in this first installment, we're going to evaluate a couple key paths as a software engineer in freelancing and how to decide which one is right for you. So um, that's me, so hello. This is going to be stored in our Road to Freelance track. If you've been following Turbo for a while, you may have noticed I've been making a lot of changes. And basically what I've been doing is I've been organizing all of the content into sequences that are appropriate for different levels or different objectives. So for example, we have an intro to development sequence that we're going to put together basically a series of projects that are good for beginners, or people who are just learning HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Node, Express, getting their feet wet. And there's going to be a series of projects to help introduce people to that. Anywhere between 8, 10 projects, and the projects will continue. So over time, we're going to be continually adding projects to different tracks. So one of the biggest questions I get from users is what tutorial should I follow in what sequence? Well, that answer varies depending on where you are. So another track that we're doing is the Road to Freelance, and that's what this particular video is for. This is going to be a guide that's accessible in the Road to Freelance track. So that's where this is going to eventually go. And if you click on this one, you'll see that this is also a sequence of projects, complete top to bottom projects that are going to be tutorials in the Road to Freelance track. Most of these are, I would say about half of these are done, and I'm going to need about another month or so to finish the rest of these. And they will all be here. And these will be projects that are appropriate if you want to become a freelance engineer. Um, and if you want to, you could even use these projects on your portfolio once you start promoting yourself. These projects will be complete, so you can actually use these as portfolio projects to showcase your work if you want to do that. So that's where this is going to eventually go. Um, so yeah, that's the changes I'm making to the site. Right now, the changes are not complete yet, so if you sign up today, your card will not be charged until April 1, which is about when I think all of this will be ready. So yeah, that's it. So thanks for watching. Let's get started. So to give you some background, I've been a freelance engineer for about 6 years, starting in 2012. So right now it is February 2018, and I've worked as a freelance software engineer in New York City since 2012, and I started out with iOS and gradually moved on to web, full stack web. So Node, Express, Angular 1, and then finally settling in on React, Redux, and I guess the MERN stack. So there are a couple key criteria to really evaluate when you're trying to break into the industry as a freelancer, and how to make those decisions. So let me just punch up my notes. So here, um, I want to discuss two primary tracks. And don't worry, these notes will all be in the actual materials provided by the membership. So track one is, I call it standard. The standard track is essentially what most people think about when they think about the freelance software engineer. So building websites for restaurants, like small businesses, lawyers, yoga studios, places like that. Putting together a website, deploying it, taking care of the whole thing top to bottom. Mostly for small and conventional style businesses. And that's what most people think about when they think about freelance software engineering. Um, and that's one sort of path you can take. The other one that I want to talk about is the startup track, which is a totally different can of worms. Um, this is obviously it's for startups, but it could be like, it doesn't have to be like a small garage startup that you read about in the internet a lot. It's more about, like, it could also be like Uber, Airbnb. Like, these are sort of more than startups now, but it's a similar requirement set. A similar skill set is required to do this. So they're both very different, and you can be a freelance engineer in either capacity. Now, to be clear, I did option two. Okay, so I was in the startup track, and I essentially spent my career in the startup track. So in the past 6 years, I've worked with startups in New York City, building MVPs, doing code refactors, things like that. And again, the two tracks have very different um, requirements, different pay scales, different ways of getting clients, different everything. So you want to really be sure which one you're looking into before you dive into it. So let's discuss sort of each one individually. So the standard track is certainly easier. There's no doubt about it. These are like the typical WordPress sites. Um, uh, Let me just, and again, all these notes will be um, in the actual materials on the website. So WordPress sites, Squarespace, stuff like that. Mostly for like restaurants, small businesses, etc. So again, it's what people typically think about when they think of a freelance engineer. So um, it's easier. So as a result, it's faster. You can sort of crank out projects at a faster pace, and it's easier to get sort of projects in and out the door. Um, but unfortunately, because it's easier, it's also cheaper. There's much more people doing it. It's more of a race to the bottom. So you get a lot of like cheap developers willing, even stateside, like domestically, you might find a person willing to work for 20 bucks an hour, 25 bucks an hour just to crank out a simple WordPress template installation, and do it for a bunch of restaurants and a bunch of places like that, barbershops, people like that, small restaurants. I think I've mentioned that already, coffee shops. Um, and so you have a tougher sort of way of earning a lot of money. The ceiling is much lower in terms of the amount of money you can make. So per project, I should say. I should caveat that by saying on a per project basis, the ceiling is much lower. So, for example, if I'm going to build a simple website for a restaurant in New York City, which is obviously a lot of money in the city, I couldn't imagine charging more than about $3,000 for like a high scale website, and even that's on the high end. Like it's going to be more like somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 for just a basic website installation. So right off the bat, you're looking at a lower ceiling on a per project basis. Um, uh, so you have to do a lot more volume, right? You have to have a lot of projects going at the same time. 2, 3, 4 times, just all the time. And it's a little frustrating because you're dealing with a lot of other people sort of undercutting your bids, and those people might not even be in America. So you're dealing with people overseas who are billing like literally like $10 an hour or like even less than that. So it's hard to explain to the client sometimes that you're really better off going with me at $20 an hour, $30 an hour, than so and so at $6 an hour. And these are the conversations you're going to have to be prepared for. So it's a little bit, um, you have to be ready for that. How to justify your rate, even if it seems really meager at $25 an hour, which it would be in this sort of environment. So um, that's number one. Um, the startup track is the exact opposite. So in the startup track, it's obviously harder, more money per project. This is an important caveat, per project. So I can speak at more in depth on this because this is what I've been doing for a number of years. So on a per project basis, you might be getting like in New York City and San Francisco. So again, consider this in the coastal areas where there's a lot more money and a lot more investment. On a per project basis, I would expect around 30,000, 25K, 30K, across a span of about anywhere between 3 and 6 months. So Um, on the low end, it's going to be around 25K. On the upper end, it might be like 50 or 60. The biggest single contract I did was around 80K, and that was over a 9-month period. Um, so the numbers are much higher, but because the projects are so much more in depth, you don't cut the same kind of volume as you do on the standard track. So I'm not doing like 8 projects at a time. At the most, I'm doing 3. I'll do 3 at a time, um, and that's a typical year for me as a contract engineer in the startup community was anywhere between 4 and 6 projects for the year. That was a typical year. So you get a lot less volume, but a much higher ceiling per project, and so that's something to consider. They each have their pros and cons. I don't want to sound like I'm underselling the standard track. In a lot of respects, I kind of, looking back, I would reconsider doing the standard track. Now, it doesn't sound like a good idea, like why they're so cheap, and it's harder. You're dealing with a lot more competition in the bottom, sort of a race to the bottom. So how do you deal with that? Well, one thing about the startup track that that I did not really properly account for breaking in 6 years ago is that a lot of the startups, virtually all the startups I worked with in the past 6 years, they don't exist anymore. They're out of business. They ran out of funding, and they couldn't raise another round, and therefore they, as a company, they no longer exist. Right? There's two startups as of today, 2018, that still exist amongst the. Um, I mean, one of them is not even a startup; it's a dev shop. So if you want to count that, that that's that exists as a sustainable business today in across 6 years of about 35 or so contracts. Oh, actually, I should say 3 because I just finished one a few months ago, so they're still kind of fresh. Um, so they're still in existence because they're young. So 3 companies that still exist across the over 30 that I've done in the past 6 years. So the sustainability, long-term sustainability, is pretty much non-existent. So there's a couple ways you want to look at this. Number one, if you want to continue contracting, like if that's your long-term goal, then you're going to be in a constant rotation of startups, and so you're basically always marketing yourself to startups, always. Every couple of weeks, you're prospecting, you're doing a new interview, talking to a new potential client. That was a way of life for me. I was doing interviews a couple times a month for 5 years, so I've done quite a number of interviews. Um, I never stopped prospecting because I always knew that whatever startup I'm working on right now, in all likelihood, 12 months from now, won't exist. So I'm gonna have to have another one in the rotation. It's kind of like, imagine you're constantly dating and you're just like, this person's not gonna be here in 6 months, so I want to have the next one lined up. Like that's kind of what it was. So you have to be ready for that if you want to be a freelancer for a long time. Now, as far as a startup goes, um, another alternative to that way of looking at it is you can use it as a stepping stone to a full-time job. To be clear, every startup that I worked with wanted me to join full-time, or almost every startup, I should say, wanted me to join full-time, right? And I never actually did it because for the most part, I knew that they wouldn't exist much longer than 12 months. Um, but that's not to say I wouldn't have considered it, right? If a startup was offering a lot of money, a lot of equity, of course I'd consider it. But they were not in a position to do so because they don't exist anymore. So if you actually find a startup that is highly sustainable, that's doing very well, and has a lot of users and revenue and growth, and they say, all right, we've been contracting with you for 3 months, we'd like to bring you on board full time. Um, that's a perfectly good approach. In fact, I would strongly advise doing that if you pursue the startup track, because that's a great way to get into a startup as an important person, as an early employee, right? And that'll, no matter what happens from there. Let's say the startup lasts for 3 years, and then they run out of runway, they burn out. it's still a good experience for you to put onto your resume, saying that, I was a lead engineer at this startup for 2 years, and then that'll sort of segue you into a more competitive position as a full-time engineer at another startup, right? Or a bigger company like Amazon or Google, right? So you can look at it that way, as like a stepping stone to a full-time role in Silicon Valley style companies, and that's a perfectly good approach, and that should work if you properly plan for it. Uh, my perspective is a little bit different. I always wanted to freelance. I never wanted to stop contracting, essentially. So what that means is within startups, I was in a constant state of prospecting that never stopped. I was always prospecting. So be aware that that'll be your way of doing business if you're doing the startup track as a contract engineer, or sometimes called a consultant. Now, going back to my original point, looking back, I'd strongly reconsider the standard track. The reason I really didn't give it much thought was because of the low pay and sort of the low quality of projects, just sort of cookie cutter projects, not very impressive. And like I knew that would mean I would be competing with a lower caliber of developer, and that's just really not something you want to get mixed up in. You can get stuck there for quite a while. Um, but looking back, the way I would approach the standard track is by taking on a bunch of projects and building replicable systems that I can apply to other projects of similar nature. Like for example, let's say there's a hair salon that opened up and they need a website. I would put together a website for maybe $2,000, like pretty cheap, right? Even less, maybe $1,500. And then I would say, why don't I also take care of your Google Places entry? When you do like a Google search for like a restaurant, or I always use restaurant, but let's say like hair salon, New York City. Right? You see these entries? They have to be formatted a certain way so that Google can show your results right here, and most salon owners won't know how to do that, right? So, and then I would sell services like how to help your SEO presence and things like that. I'll do a little bit of social media networking marketing, depending on whether or not they have that, email marketing stuff that most small business owners really wouldn't have a good grip on. Now, that's still going to pay pretty low. I would charge something monthly, like the hosting is $40 a month, and then plus the ancillary services another $100 a month, or maybe $150, for a total package of $200 a month. I'll just take care of all that stuff for you, right? And then over a period of 5 years, let's say you have, like let's say you're able to get up to 1,000 small businesses doing that. Well, 1,000 times $200 a month, that's what you're making now, right? After 5 years. Now that's how I would look at the standard track, because the idea here is that these are much more replicable projects, right? And they're very easy, they're very cookie cutter, and you can just sort of rubber stamp them out once you have a system built in. Having a system probably takes around 6 to 12 months, depending on your stack and your skill level and just how focused you are. But basically, you want to look at the first year as getting your systems in place, and then spend the ensuing couple years just getting more and more people on that system. And then after year 5, which is where I am right now, you would have sort of you would have a good base of just recurring revenue. Now, there are going to be headaches along the way. There's always going to be headaches. This isn't like a perfect system. This isn't a perfect utopia. You're going to get clients calling you at 1 o'clock in the morning saying like, hey, my site's down or whatever, and you have to deal with those headaches. But it's not like this was free of headaches either. The startup track had a lot of headaches. I don't like it when they go out of business. I did want to join the right startup full time, but it never happened because they all went under. So there's all pros and cons. So the way I would look at the standard track is exactly what I described. And if it was 5 years ago, 2012, knowing what I know now, would I make that decision? Probably. I would make the decision of going with a standard track and working off volume on a system that I can replicate. To be fair, in 2012, I didn't possess the skill. So even if I wanted to do that, I wouldn't have been able to, simply because of my lack of skill. I was only an iOS developer at that point. So you want to look at those two that way. Those are the two main ways of looking at the tracks. Now, um, oftentimes what happens with beginners, and I see this a lot, is they conflate the two tracks. So here's what I mean. The startup track is clearly what the boot camps train for, right? They all train for Node, Express, Ruby on Rails, React, jQuery. Well, jQuery is in both, but MongoDB, stuff like that. Um, and boot camps train for this track. Oftentimes what happens is you get a beginner developer who just like finished a boot camp or did a lot of self-training with sort of a boot camp curriculum, and they'll apply those techniques to the standard track without really knowing it. They're conflating the two tracks, and this is not a good idea. You need to really understand which one you're dealing with, because let's say I just graduated a boot camp, right? I'm eager, I'm ready to get started. I'll find whatever work I can get. So my friend runs a bar in Bushwick or someplace in Brooklyn, and then he's like, I need to upgrade on my website. So I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. I need to build up my portfolio. Next thing you know, I'm building Node Express. Well, Node Express is fine, but like a React Redux website for this guy's bar, right? And that's way too much. With a MongoDB GraphQL server, I'm just doing way too much. Hooking up to Firebase for real-time, connectivity, really like flexing my muscle with the technical capability for something that just doesn't need it. Now, what's going to happen is, this is for a beginner. If you're a beginner, so a year one of your development career, what's going to happen is you're going to underestimate the amount of time it takes to do what you're trying to do, and as a result, underestimate the cost. So you're thinking you can hammer this out in 2 weeks, but you're putting in all these sophisticated tools, frameworks, libraries for just a simple bar in Brooklyn, that needs nothing more than just like drink specials, a menu, stuff like that. And next thing you know, you're on, week 6, week 7, and the project is just stalling out. And your friend's like, hey, like what's the story? Like I kind of need a solution here soon. And then, I've seen this happen. So this is not a theoretical. Like I'm recounting situations that I've seen, and depending on how you handle it, you might come back with, well, it's taking longer than I thought. There are more problems I didn't anticipate. I might need to raise the rate. I know we agreed on $500. I might need to make it 2,000 because I'm putting in all this hours. It might cause some, tension, or worse yet, I see this happen. This is what the most common outcome is: the developer just sort of leaves the project. He's like, yeah, just I can't finish this. I have too much other stuff going on. I gotta get ready for these interviews. I'm not in a position to finish this project. And that's typically what happens, right? So the reason this happened is because the two tracks have been conflated. They're not really the same. Well, if you have a simple project, then keep it simple, right? So even if you're doing, if you went to a boot camp that taught you all this, these sophisticated libraries, frameworks, and tools, and you got your first sort of contract gig, which is just to make a website for a bar. Well, then use the appropriate tools. Maybe even use WordPress or Squarespace. Like, keep it simple, right? Get it out the door. What you really want at that point is just a satisfied client. Excuse me. So that's what I often see here between these two. So what that means is the two tracks are not clearly identified, and people, newcomers, sort of don't realize it's two different things, right? I do see it the other way as well, where people will apply standard track solutions to a startup. So this is where you get a startup that entirely runs on WordPress, and the WordPress installation is really a conglomeration of different WordPress plugins to sort of get the startup um, working the way they want it to. Like a user registration plugin, an email plugin, like a plugin for loading a map, things like that. And it becomes this huge like plugin project. And there's only so long that's going to work. Eventually, that's going to have to be migrated off of WordPress and put onto a real startup track. Now, I don't really see that from beginners. That's not really a beginner move. I see that more often from cheap overseas developers trying to apply the replicable sequence to a startup. So it's more of a move that I see from overseas developers working at like $5 an hour, just trying to hammer in rubber stamp solutions to a startup. So it's not really, I don't really see a beginner making a mistake like that. That would be kind of strange. Um, so those are the key criteria to be aware of amongst these two tracks. Let me make sure I have all the notes covered here. One more point I just want to go back to is that going back to the standard track, at first it seemed like I was kind of underselling it because of the low ceiling, but keep in mind it's a much higher market volume. So, in New York City alone, there's something like 24,000 restaurants or some crazy number like that. There are not 24,000 startups. I want to be very clear about that. So again, you want to really think in terms of the long-term play here. All right, what's the good long-term play? If I have, 2,000 cookie cutter websites, where I manage the hosting, a couple social networks, but this is all automated. Like you shouldn't be manually doing all this. But if I have 2,000 of them and each one is paying me, $100 a month to do all that, well, you do the math. That's a pretty nice little outcome. It's not little at all. It's a pretty nice outcome after maybe a 5-year period. So if you think of it from that standpoint, there's no reason why that couldn't happen in within a 5-year window if you're starting out. In fact, like I said, if this was 5 years ago, I would probably take that route if I possessed the ability, if I possessed the skill at that point, which I didn't. So I didn't really even have the option. But if I did, I would pursue that route, so that in this at this point, 5 years later, I would have a good base of recurring income. Where I miscalculated was that I thought the startups that I worked with were much more sustainable than they actually were. So in 2012, my perspective in terms of percentages was way off. So, I thought like out of 10 startups, like maybe 4 or 5 would go out of business, and the other 4 or 5 would be 5 or 6, excuse me, would be sustainable companies and I would be a CTO at one of them. After 2 or 3 years, I'd be the CTO of one of those. That was my initial play. Um, but my perspective was way off. It's more like after, well, the actual math is 9 of them will fail, right? So there's of the companies I've worked with, only 3 still exist today, and one of them is a dev shop. It's not a startup. So my numbers were off. So if I had known then what I know now, I would take this under much stronger consideration. So those are the 2 tracks that I've identified as a freelance engineer in the past 6 years, and the key considerations to what going into each one. So take that for what it's worth. Hopefully you found this informative. In part 2 of this guide to freelancing, we are going to discuss, let me just see here, preparation with regard to each one of these tracks. So how to sell yourself to these companies depending on which track you're pursuing, and that also has a pretty different sort of technique depending on which track. There are some consistencies, but for the most part, selling yourself to a startup requires a different presentation than selling yourself to a standard company, a small business, or a conventional company like that. So that's going to be part 2 of this series. Hopefully you'll find that helpful as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.